on today's World Insight. China's green strategy in the next 50 years mapped out. How feasible is the guidance toward a net carbon zero future? Let's count the ways. And China's United Nations comeback 50 years ago, made possible with a little help from friends. A seasoned Pakistani diplomat recalls how the art of go-between diplomacy went a long way in restoring China's lawful UN seat.
It was quite clear in the bilateral exchanges that took place between the Pakistani ambassador and the US ambassador when we told him that we are going to go for the vote.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Live from Beijing, I'm Tian Wei. China has spelled out guidance on meeting its carbon commitments in the next decade. The country aims to hit peak emissions before 2030 and become carbon neutral by 2060. The guideline lays out the overarching principles, the groundwork of all upcoming policies. It says major progress is expected in the next 8 years in China's transition to a green economy. The plan aims to have energy consumption in key industries to be at optimum levels based on global standards. By 2030, according to the plan, China expects to be way past the tipping point of sustainable and efficient systems that power its economy. The guideline also was clear on having non-fossil fuel energy account for almost 80% of China's total consumption. That's actually a very exciting plan. To talk about that, I'm joined in Washington, D.C., Wu Changhua, China Director of the Office of Jeremy Rifkin. And in Berlin via Skype, Michael Melling, Deputy Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research with MIT. What a pleasure to see both of you, ladies and gentlemen. It's great news. The blueprint is out, long expected. What can we read out of all of these numbers that are printed out in the blueprint? Ms. Wu, very briefly first.
It's a very significant and also exciting move forward. And from the national government, now we have clearly defined, I call it a bending the curve decarbonization plan, that the government really started to put the two targets, capping emissions before 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060, at the core of all government policy making process. Right. The plan has laid out and also details actually to deliver that. It's fascinating to see the progress.
Before 2030, before 2060, the before is very exciting, but let me just go through some of the specific numbers Ms. Wu just talked about. You know, energy consumption per unit of GDP will be lower by 13.5% from 2020 level. By 2025, I'm talking about. Carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP will be lowered by 18% from 2020 level. The share of non-fossil energy consumption will be reaching around 20%. Forest coverage, 24.1%. Forest stock volume will rise into 18 billion cubic meters. These are sheer numbers, but these numbers actually say a lot of things. Mr. Melling.
Well, to me, what I take out of this blueprint, and first of all, thank you for having me, is that China recognizes the sheer scope and scale of the challenge. And with this long-term vision and all the steps on the path towards that long-term goal, it's showing that it takes the challenge seriously. And it is a challenge. And I think many other countries, are embarking on the same journey. There will be different ways to get there, but very clearly China has calculated sort of how it will get there step by step.
They have calculated very carefully because this has been a long expected plan, Ms. Wu. I mean, among the plan, the ways to get there is as important as, the degrees to which to work for. For example, prioritizing conservation, leverage the strengths of government and the market. Meanwhile, coordinating efforts on domestic and international fronts. This sounds a little bit abstract, but I know you would explain to us a little bit later. And guarding against the risks. Among all of these principles, which do you see is most critical?
There are definitely many numbers actually in the current blueprint, but if you look carefully, you could pretty much actually identify three major levers actually the government is going to moving ahead in terms of the actions. One is decoupling growth and with energy consumption, with also carbon intensity there as well. And the second actually lever or pillar actually is really switching away from coal and more replaced by non-fossil fuel energies there. And the third pillar, of course, is called like nature-based solutions, particularly emphasizing the importance, actually, ecosystem functions, actually, of the forest there. So it's not confusing. Those are the three major pillars, actually, numbers of targets in the current plan. And in terms of energy efficiency, I think there are still a lot of low-hanging fruits there. I think energy conservation or energy efficiency has been and will continue to be one of the major drivers actually to deliver the agenda, even though it's getting more difficult in a way because it requires more technology innovation and financing there as well. But in the meantime, if you look at the dramatic drop of solar energies, renewable energies there, so they are becoming gradually low-hanging fruits part as well, plus energy storage among others there. So in a nutshell, I think it is clear, it's integrated, and we know for sure, at least I have the confidence that the blueprint or the goal is set to succeed and not set for failure.
Right. We already see, Mr. Melling, both the carbon market in operation in China. Of course, now at this moment, it's still the lower hanging fruit of the carbon trading. On the other hand, we also see the government is not likely to cap any, limit in terms of the electricity price for those high energy consumption industries. So a lot of signals are indicating to us that this plan is not a joke. It is really about step by step to get there.
Well, yes, I think what you're hinting at, what you're alluding to, is the fact that it becomes a challenge and it becomes more expensive and more difficult to continue to survive for a number of energy-intensive industries in particular. And different countries, different jurisdictions, including, say, the European Union, I'm right now in Europe, have, of course, sought to shield them and have, over time, had various tools at their disposal and used, like free allocation of these tradable units to protect industry. But at some point, we all recognize we can no longer protect because we have to expose them to the signals, to the incentives towards decarbonization. And that's a difficult transition. So I applaud China if it's already spelling out that transformation will be necessary and there will not be protection throughout the whole path towards decarbonization.
We are already feeling the pinch, quote unquote, a little bit. Ms. Wu, for example, about the so-called electricity or energy crisis that's also have its impact on China. But at this point, we know that there is investigation about the coal prices. There's also a lot of things being discussed at government and the government industry level about how prices are being set. What is the quote unquote crisis really like? Ms. Wu, how do you see these very different directions of signals together with coming out of this blueprint?
Well, I think the current energy crunch or power shortage China has been experiencing definitely has exposed the difficulties and complexities of the energy system management and transformation. And yes, we have policies driving around the carbon intensity, around energy efficiency, and trying to drive the switch from fossil fuels to non-fossil fuels. But somehow there are other elements around energy security, around essential services access, or justice, equity issues in the energy system there, so that we have to make sure we address them as well. So on one side, I think it definitely poses the challenges, but in the meantime, actually offer the opportunity for decision makers to understand it, understand the complexities, so that we'll be able to make the right directions.
Right. So that people have a sound plan already in their mind. It's not going to be just about the goals, it's also about how to get there. Another important question, Ms. Wu, that you heard at the the anniversary celebrating the 50th anniversary of China's restoration of lawful seat of the United Nations being held on Monday in Beijing. Chinese President Xi Jinping once again pledged about China's efforts in terms of leading up to COP26 and also in terms of carbon targets. What among those words to you is the most concrete, particularly when you look at the plan that we have on hand?
Well, I definitely see the commitment, political commitment in particular from Chinese leadership in terms of the transition. And we all recognize more than ever China has to transform. And its infrastructure, its energy system, as well as its whole economy there. So it's the level of confidence that the political leaders in China have offered actually to its own people, but also to the international community, that China is seriously taking the action.
All right, we've got 30 seconds only left. Mr. Melling, tell me more about what would all these mean leading up to COP26?
Well, stepping back, I feel we look at what different countries bring to Glasgow in a week's time. And I think some actors like the European Union, they come with a strong luggage, a strong suitcase full of measures. They have the European Green Deal, they have the Fit for 55 package, etc. The US, it's a little bit less clear because, as you know, President Biden has had quite some difficulties getting through some of his legislative measures, including climate policy. For China, I also feel rather comfortable.
Okay.
You not only have the new ETS, but you also have this plan. They come with a strong plan, yes, definitely.
We'll see how things would develop leading up to COP26. For now, thank you so much for both of you. Wu Changhua, Michael Melling, all the best. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from CGTN. China's United Nations comeback 50 years ago made possible with a little help from friends. A seasoned Pakistani diplomat recalls how the art of go-between diplomacy went a long way in restoring China's lawful UN seat. The piece of eyewitness history next. Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The Chinese have always known that China would be able to restore its lawful seat at the United Nations, but it could be done better only with friends' help, particularly those in the developing countries. And one of those loyal friends is certainly Pakistan. Pakistan has been acting as the intermediary between China and the U.S. and played a key role in Henry Kissinger's secret visit to China just 3 months prior to the UN General Assembly that welcomed China back. A group of Western countries at that time were trying to block the resolution for years. But when word came out, the U.S. was secretly researching and also reaching out to China, things changed. Munir Akram was then serving as the second secretary of the Pakistani delegation to the United Nations. He was not only present at the General Assembly at the time, but was actually relaying messages between Pakistan and, of course, with the messages of China and the U.S. Recalling the whole exchange, he said, quote, "Diplomacy is an art. It has to be practiced delicately and subtly." So let's take a listen to the story he told about 50 years ago. 50 years of China's restoration of its lawful seat in the United Nations.
Yes, it is a historic day, and I still recall that historic day when China's rights were restored at the United Nations 50 years ago, with the adoption of Resolution 2578 by the General Assembly. It was a proud moment for friends of China, especially Pakistan, to have co-sponsored that resolution and to welcome China back into the United Nations to assume its rightful place.
At that time, Mr. Ambassador, you were a very young diplomat.
Yes, I was a second secretary in the Pakistani delegation, but that memory is still very vivid of this great moment in history.
I know it was not easy. You know, at the very beginning, there were several attempts to make it right, but did not happen until that day. Tell me about the preparations you and your Chinese colleagues went through.
There were a number of countries which were attempting to block the adoption by putting new conditions. But I think the international community by then began to had realized that China could not be kept out of the international community. And the prior negotiations which had taken place between China and the United States in the secret diplomacy of Mr. Kissinger, who flew to China from Pakistan for his first secret meeting in Beijing, all these were preparatory steps to restore China's place in the international community. And I think the world realized that China must be welcomed back into the international community and be allowed to assume its rightful place in the United Nations.
Though the U.S. voted no at that time.
Yes, as you know, U.S. diplomacy is very complex. Sometimes they want to do some things and say something else. But everybody realized that the United States itself had recognized that China had to be recognized for the reality that it was, and therefore the rest of the world did not wait for the United States to change its formal position. They supported the proposal from Pakistan and other friends of China to restore China's rights immediately.
At that time, as a young diplomat, you did feel the pressure, you know, building up, leading up to that resolution. After all, nobody knows the result until it is being voted.
That's right. But, but you know, we had been trying to get that resolution adopted for several years at the General Assembly. And for several years, the group that was led by some Western powers blocked the adoption of that resolution through various procedural means. But once the international community realized that the United States itself was negotiating and talking to China, I think the picture changed very quickly.
Sorry for my historic ignorance, but at the time, how did many other countries know that the U.S. was in secret diplomacy with China already?
Well, you know, in the United States, nothing is kept secret for very long. So the leakage of all the information about the talks between Mr. Kissinger and the Chinese leadership became public news during the course of 1971, before the General Assembly met, and that provided sufficient grounds for many countries who were sitting on the fence to then come in and support the proposal for restoration of China's rights in the UN.
So it was quite dramatic and ironic, isn't it? On the one hand, the secret diplomacy is going on between China and the United States. Others already knew, you know, through grapevines. On the other hand, George Bush Sr., as the representative of the United States then, was quite solemn in a way, looking at the results of the resolution.
That's right. Of course, he was only following instructions at that time from the government to oppose the resolution. But of course, it was quite clear in the bilateral exchanges that took place between the Pakistani ambassador and the US ambassador when we told them that we are going to go for the vote and that we are confident of winning the vote on this occasion. They were quietly accepted. They had accepted the outcome.
Were you there? Were you present when they were having this kinds of, some kinds of minor exchanges about what might be the result?
Yes, Ms. Tian, I was the one carrying the messages between the two ambassadors.
Wow. Wow, what was it like when you were given the task to pass that message to the other side? It must be quite a dramatic moment. What was it like for a young diplomat?
Well, it was quite dramatic. It was a great experience in diplomacy while supporting China's rights. We, of course, we were the intermediaries, and therefore we exchanged the communications and told the United States we were going for the vote. And the US ambassador, in his note, was very clear. He said, we are still friends.
You know, after the voting of the resolution, and certainly it's already passed by almost by the majority of the United Nations members, and people began to dance. You know, African delegates, they're very expressive. What was it like for you? Where were you? Sitting in that corner, or also already dancing with them, or passing another message to different parties?
Yes, as you know, our African colleagues, as you said, are very expressive, and of course, they were dancing on the floor, including Ambassador Salim, who was the ambassador of Tanzania and was captured in pictures. Pakistanis, of course, are a little more subdued, but we were all smiles. We were congratulating each other, and we were congratulating all our friends. And of course, in a few days later, we welcomed in person the first Chinese delegation to the United Nations, led by Deputy Foreign Minister Chia Kuan-hua and the first permanent representative of China, Ambassador Huang Hua. We welcomed them, and we had great bilateral exchanges with the first Chinese delegation and discussed the whole gamut of the agenda of the General Assembly and the issues which were being considered there. So it was a good, important first exchange. Pakistan at that time was in crisis because we had the Bangladesh crisis at that time, and with Indian interference in East Pakistan at that time. So we were in crisis, and China was very supportive to Pakistan immediately after its entry into the United Nations. China supported Pakistan's territorial integrity in the Security Council when it assumed its seat in the Security Council after its entry in September. The first debates in the Security Council on the India-Pakistan issue took place in late November and early December, and China was very vocal and very strong in its support for Pakistan, which we will never forget.
Ms. Ambassador, you might be aware at a recent meeting on the occasion of 50th anniversary of China's restoration of the UN seat, Chinese President Xi Jinping once again reaffirmed China's commitment to uphold the UN as the international governance system and the international law as the principle for all. How do you see the importance of that today, particularly when there's argument about whether the UN is still important or not, and whether multilateralism it is still possible or not?
Well, I think the UN Charter's principles, President Xi is quite right, because the UN Charter's principles, which provide for non-use of force or threat of use of force in international relations, They provide for respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, which provide for non-interference in their internal affairs. These are basic principles, and if these principles are violated, the world order, international peace and security will be under grave threat. Therefore, it is important that we should continue to construct a world which is based upon these fundamental principles, because otherwise there will be chaos and conflict across the world. And we must also remember that the United Nations system provides for international cooperation to promote better lives for all peoples of the world through international cooperation. And this is a cardinal principle of the UN, international cooperation, that is cooperation in a multilateral framework to promote the prosperity and peace for all peoples. And this is a fundamental vision, and it is important that China, through the statement of President Xi Jinping, has reaffirmed this important concept, this important basis for global order, which is critical. And we hope that we will, of course, work at the United Nations to support this concept, to support the United Nations in upholding these principles.
Ambassador Munir Akram, who is the Pakistani permanent representative to the United Nations. He was both a witness and a messenger in the important day 50 years ago when China restored its lawful seat at the United Nations. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now. Good night.